I remember when my youngest son was about 10, 11 years old, and my husband took him away for a weekend to have the talk about sex. And I remember when he came back from that talk and he looked at me with these new eyes of, oh my goodness, like I'm looking at my mom and now I understand what sex is. And he verbalized that and he's like, Mom, like Dad told me all this stuff about sex and I just have to tell you, I feel like I'm too young to know these things. And I said, hey, I know, buddy, but we really want to talk to you about sex before you hear about it from the world and just the media and your friends. Like, we want to give you a good framework for that. And he said, yeah, I get that. Well, my son went away to play and then he came back a few hours later and he said, Mom, I've been thinking the way the world is going, I'm gonna have to have this talk with my kids when they're like 4 years old. And boy, was he prophetic when he said that. That was probably about like 9 or 10 years ago. And I look at where we are today and I tell parents that they do need to start talking to their kids about sex at about 3 or 4 years old. Why? Because everyone's talking to 3 or 4-year-olds about how to understand their bodies and their gender and their sexuality. And we as parents really want to have a strong voice and framing that for them. And so, no, you don't have to sit them down and have the full talk for a toddler or a 3 or 4-year-old. But what you really need to be doing is creating that conversation to where it's normal to have talks about sex. Not just when you take them away for a weekend, but throughout the day and throughout the week and throughout the years and throughout different questions that they have. You want to establish the idea that you are a safe place to go to when your kids have real questions about sexual desire, about their bodies, about their confusion, or about masturbation or pornography. If you don't have those conversations very early on, the reality is the media and the culture is going to have that conversation for you. And so you start at a very early level, at a very basic level with what your kids can understand. And it can be calling the body parts what they actually are instead of making up fun names, but talking about how our bodies have beauty to them and they have function to them, about this is how we reproduce, how we make babies, and there's some great resources, books that you can use at different ages to actually articulate that to kids, whether they're 3 or 4 or 5 or all the way into the teen years. And so you're looking for age-appropriate ways to actually give them the vocabulary so that they can talk to you about sex. Now, when you get into those ages of 7 or 8, it's important to have conversations with them, yes, about the goodness of sex, but also about things that they're likely to encounter, like images that are pornographic. And again, there are resources that can explain the difference between what you might call good pictures and bad pictures, and why certain parts of our body are unique and special. You don't want to add shame to that, but say, hey, we treat different parts of our bodies differently. And that's why we wear clothes over certain parts of our body. And that's why we don't look at people when they're naked. That's why we don't allow people to touch us in certain places, because those are special parts that God created in our body. And here's what the purpose of them is. And then you've got to recognize that around the ages of 10 to 12, because of technology and just where culture is going, your child will be exposed to things like pornographic images, and they will be facing questions about how do we define gender and what do we do with sexual drive and desire. And that's where you're going to need to get into more detailed conversations about just why God gave us sexual drive and desire and how do we steward that. And I really encourage you as a parent to do your own work in pursuing sexual healing and wholeness. Now, why is that so key? Because a lot of the times when we get into those tender and sensitive conversations, we hold back because we haven't dealt with our own pain. We haven't dealt with maybe the shame of things that we've done in the past. We're afraid that our kids are going to ask us what we did with our sexuality. And when we've walked through that ourselves, we can now say with greater security and confidence that, this is what happened to me when I was a teenager, or these are some choices that I made that now when I look back, I regret, or this is what I've learned over the years. And so when you're talking to your kids about sex, you're also a mentor to them. You're saying, hey, let me pass on the wisdom that I've learned through the years, and I'd love to save you from some of the pain that I experienced when I was your age. With also realizing that the culture that our kids are growing up in today is very different from the culture that we grew up in. Having sexual conversations is much more normal to them. There's a lot of introduction of just what does sexual desires and drives mean our kids are asking questions that we never even thought of when we were their age. And so we want to continually be in that learning mode as well. One of the things that has really helped me as a parent is, instead of thinking about sexually educating my kids, I think about sexually discipling them. How do I walk with them on the journey of stewarding their sexuality in a way that reflects God's design and that deals with the nuance and the struggle and, in some cases, the pain that they might be walking through? How do I really help them become just mature human beings and not just tell them, do this behavior or don't do that behavior? That's really the heart of a parent, and we want to apply that to the sexual conversation as well. One thing I've really learned over years of ministry is that what we believe about sex begins with what we believe about God. And that's going to be critical to helping your kids navigate some of what's happening in our culture today related to sexuality. Honestly, it's been helpful for me as an adult to navigate that. When we look at trends that just continue to change year over year in terms of what's acceptable sexually, how we define our sexuality and gender identity, sometimes as a parent you might feel like your head is spinning, like, how did we get here? My parents didn't have to have these conversations with me. Why do I have to have them with my kids? Well, our kids really are growing up in a culture that views sexuality and human identity very differently than maybe we did 30 or 40 years ago. In some ways, it's accelerated very quickly within the last 5 or 10 years. And so we really need to be thoughtful and prayerful about how we help our kids navigate this. And I want to go back to what I said a minute ago. It begins with what we believe about God. Everything that we conclude about what is healthy sexuality, what does wholeness look like, it really goes back to the roots of what does it mean to be human and why are we sexual people. If you're coming from a Christian worldview, a biblical worldview, we say, okay, well, that's part of God's design. He intentionally created sexuality for a purpose. If you're not coming from a biblical worldview, then really in our culture today, sex and gender identity and sexual identity is all about finding yourself. It's about discovering the authentic you and living out of that. And so what we have for Christian parents is we have parents trying to teach their kids how to steward their sexuality in a culture that has a very different definition of sexual wholeness and brokenness. And we've got to make that distinction for our kids. One of the mistakes I think we can make as parents today is we only talk about behavior instead of getting to the underlying worldview issues. And the truth of it is, when we read the Bible, Jesus said very clearly over and over again that if you follow me, you're going to be different from this world. You might actually run against the culture, and people might not like you because of that. And that is really true when we look at the sexual climate today. If we're going to take Jesus at his word and follow the text of Scripture faithfully, we see that God really has created sexuality in terms of male and female in the covenant of marriage, and that's the celebration of a sexual union. And that's a very different sexual narrative than what most of our world and culture is working with today. And so we have to prepare our kids that if we really choose to be followers of Jesus Christ, we're going to see some things very differently, not just sexually, but in every area of life, than our neighbors do, than our friends and coworkers might. And we have to learn to talk through what those differences are. Again, not just focusing on a behavior, this is sin or this isn't sin, but let's get at where people's heart is. Who do they believe God is? What do they think it means to flourish as human beings? And when we begin to have conversations at that level, our kids can really distinguish between what they may be hearing in culture and what they may be learning through the Scripture and through your parenting. And then ultimately, here's where the scary part is. We've got to let our kids begin to make their own decisions about who they believe God is. And hey, I've been through that as a parent. When they get to those late teen years and early adult years, it's really their choice of what they're going to do with the Lord and how they're going to understand their sexuality. But we get to be in that place of influence and mentoring and coaching, and most importantly, just walking in our own faithful journey of honoring God with our own sexuality.